Welcome to How to Start and Maintain a Nonprofit Organization in Maryland. This is a training from Community Law Center in Maryland, and my name is Shayna Roth-Gormley. I'm a staff attorney at Community Law Center. Today we're going to cover how to start a nonprofit from the early stages of getting started through bylaws, incorporation, 501c3 tax exemption, and ongoing compliance. Community Law Center is a nonprofit legal services provider. We work with community and nonprofit organizations throughout Maryland to promote stronger nonprofits and more vibrant neighborhoods. We can assist with all kinds of legal issues, from forming, reviving, and maintaining a nonprofit, including the topics we're going to cover today: bylaws, incorporation, and 501c3 tax exemption, and other issues as well, including leasing and transferring real property, zoning appeals, contract negotiations and drafting, employment issues, intellectual property like copyright and trademark, and for community associations, issues like nuisance properties, vacant and abandoned properties, and drug nuisance, and liquor license protest for nuisance liquor establishments, and more. So if your organization has a legal issue now or in the future, please keep Community Law Center in mind because we can provide legal services. And I'll talk more at the end of the workshop about how to access those services. Today's workshop is just for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice. Legal advice should really be tailored to the organization and to the specific situation. So please contact us if your organization would like to become a client and receive legal advice. What is a nonprofit? A nonprofit in Maryland, the official term is a non-stock corporation. A nonprofit is an organization created for a purpose other than generating a profit. It has a charitable mission. A nonprofit can make a profit, so that's one thing that is sometimes a little bit confusing about the term, but that profit that the organization makes has to go back into its activities and programming. So if you make more revenue than you have in expenses, you just have to put that revenue back into the organization and the work it does. A nonprofit does not have an owner and does not distribute income to members, directors, or officers. So unlike a for-profit, where you have stockholders and an owner, anyone who owns the company can take dividends of its profit. With a nonprofit, there is no owner. It's managed by a board of directors in the public interest, but that board of directors does not get to profit off of the organization. So anything that the organization makes has to go back into its work. Some types of business entities that are for-profit and not nonprofit are stock corporations, limited liability companies or LLCs, partnerships, and sole proprietorships. So if you have started one of these types of entities, you've started a for-profit business and not a nonprofit, and you'll have to go back and start over or convert your for-profit into a nonprofit, which may require working with an attorney to make sure that you do that properly. Some types of nonprofit organizations. One type that you often hear about, sometimes interchangeably with a nonprofit, is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. This type of organization is a nonprofit. It's a specific type of nonprofit. And what it means if you are a 501c3 is that your organization has been recognized by the IRS as operating exclusively for charitable, religious, scientific, educational, or certain other purposes. And one reason that many organizations try to get this 501c3 status is that the charitable donations that the community, that your donors make to the organization are tax deductible for the donor. So that's a big incentive for your donors to give to you as opposed to some other organization. They'll get that tax break. So that's one benefit, and we'll talk more about 501c3s later in the workshop. Another type of nonprofit organization is a foundation. So I like to include this type of nonprofit in the workshop because often groups that come to us as they're getting started, they are thinking about what the organization will do, how it will operate, what it will be called, and they may choose to honor a family member or someone in the community who has done important work, and they'll name the organization after that person, and they'll say, that person's name, foundation. One thing to keep in mind with this, when you use the word foundation, is that many people think of organizations that already have some kind of endowment. They have their own funding. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, has funding through Bill and Melinda Gates. So sometimes when people hear foundation, they might think, oh, this is an organization that has its own funds to do the charitable work that it does, and it funds other groups. It won't be seeking grants from anyone else. So if your organization is planning to ask for donations and grants, you may not want to use the word foundation, because it may give the sense that this is an organization that already has funding and doesn't need our support. Some preliminary questions to think about as you're getting started with the organization. You'll want to think about, why are we forming this nonprofit? What's the need here that we're serving that no one else has served with other nonprofit work? Who are we serving? What's the community that we are trying to support? What are the services we're providing, and who needs those services? And then who will assist with doing the work? It's going to be a lot of work to start the organization and to actually do its activities. So who are we going to bring in as part of the board? Who will be our volunteers or our staff if we have funding to pay the staff? When will we have time to form and run the organization? And again, this comes back to, do we have a board of directors that can take on all of the responsibilities of running and maintaining the organization? And how will we find the funding we need to support the organization? So particularly at the beginning of starting a nonprofit, it's going to be the board of directors and the networks of the board and the community that supports the organization who are getting it started. It's difficult to find funding to start an organization, so often that startup money comes from the board of directors. And then beyond that, as the organization grows, how will we begin to develop those relationships with donors and grant makers that will need to support our work financially? Starting and maintaining a nonprofit is not easy, so you must have a charitable purpose, and it's not just about getting yourself a job. So it may take several years or more for an organization to raise the funds to be able to support paid staff. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you are planning to do this work full-time as part of the organization, that may be several years down the road. And right now you may have to focus on being on the board of directors as an unpaid director while you build the organization, until you can get to the point where the organization will be able to support a staff. You don't want to think of a nonprofit as a tax shelter or a sideline for a for-profit business. That could get you in trouble with the IRS as IRS fraud. The value of donated time and services from your volunteers, your board, is not tax deductible for those people. So they can deduct their charitable contributions that are financial, but they can't deduct their time and services. A board of directors of the nonprofit is who is in control and governs the organization, not the founder, not any one person alone. So that's something to keep in mind, and nonprofits are publicly governed by regulation. So there are a number of rules and regulations that nonprofits have to keep in mind and abide by. And then it's not easy to get grants. You really need to have a fundraising plan and a business plan that says, here's the money that we need to support our programs, and here's our plan, our specific, what we've thought about for how to approach donors, how to tell our story, how to build the relationships with grant makers so that we can get the money that we need to run the organization. Founders. So often the people that attend these workshops are nonprofit founders. They came up with the idea for the organization, they've done the early work, and they are the ones who are committed to seeing it through to start and make the organization successful. It's important to keep in mind that unlike with a for-profit business, the founder of a nonprofit does not own or control the organization. Their role in the organization is at the discretion of the board of directors at all times. So the nonprofit is governed by its board of directors, and it's the board together that makes all policy decisions for the organization, including hiring and evaluating the CEO or executive director, and including who will be part of the board if it's not a membership organization, which I'll talk about. So a founder's involvement is at the discretion of the board of directors. And there have been cases where a board has said, we don't think that the founder is on the same page any longer, and they have removed that founder. So that's something to really keep in mind, that when you create a nonprofit, you are giving up control of what that organization does. A founder can absolutely be on the board of directors, but they are one voice and one vote on the board. So it's really important, as you're putting together a board of directors, to find people who share your vision for what the organization will do and what its activities will be, and who are going to work together to make the organization successful. So sometimes founders and others hear that and they think, well, I'm not ready to give up control of this project and this organization that I want to create. So some alternatives to starting a nonprofit that has to be governed by a board of directors, you might seek a fellowship. There are organizations that will fund someone to do a project or to do charitable work for a certain amount of time. And so that might be a place to start, where you say, I will do this work that's funded for a year or 2 years, and maybe at the end of that time, then we can see where things are, and maybe at that point, then you would start a nonprofit. You could also find a group with a similar mission and partner with that group or volunteer with them, so that you are one project of the organization that already exists. And that might give you some autonomy. You would still be subject to that organization's rules and governance. Another option is fiscal sponsorship. Fiscal sponsorship is an arrangement where you have a donor who wants to contribute to your organization, but your organization does not yet have 501c3 status. So you find a fiscal sponsor that does have 501c3 status, and you come to an arrangement with that group where donors can contribute to your organization through the fiscal sponsor. So the donor still gets the tax deduction for making a contribution to a 501c3. Your organization still gets the donation, and the sponsor usually takes 10% of the donation as their fee. And they often provide other services. They help the organization build capacity, they manage its finances, they file its taxes. So there may be lots of benefits for new organizations in addition to working with the 501c3 and being able to use its status. Some things you want to consider with this type of arrangement: fiscal sponsors are legally responsible for the activities of sponsored groups. So they may say, our 501c3 status is on the line, and we are concerned that this program that you're doing may not be considered by the IRS as 501c3 charitable. So we want you to change your program around. So you may have to give up some control of your programming with this type of arrangement. So it's really important to have an agreement in writing with your fiscal sponsor, laying out, here's how we'll work together, here's what our obligations are on each side, and here's what the fee is that the sponsor will take. And if the sponsored organization ever gets its own 501c3 status, how do we terminate this fiscal sponsorship? So some other steps to getting started. One of the ones that's really important to do early on in the process is to gather a core group of people. Eventually this group will become your board of directors, but for now it's really important to get them involved early so that they can be part of the conversations and they can have buy-in into the process and say, we were there from the beginning and we know why these decisions were made. Together, that core group of people will determine what the organization will do and create a mission statement. It will pick an available name. So you can go to that website, that's the State Department of Assessments and Taxation, SDAT, and you can check on whether the name that you hope to use for your organization is available. If someone else is already using that name, you'll need to pick another name so that you can find one that's unique in Maryland. You can also look up your organization once it's established. Its information will be public on that SDAT website. You'll start to raise money to get through setup, which, if you're planning to incorporate and apply for 501c3 status, may be a cost of $500 or more. And then you'll start to formalize your board and elect interim leaders. So in Maryland, you'll need to have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. So you'll start to move toward becoming a more organized and formal group with specific roles for the people involved.